Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Usman Sadiq Paracha, and today we would be having our lecture number 17 of the subject Applied Quantitative Analysis and Practices. Now, in our previous lecture, we were focusing on data transformation issues, and like we have been discussing before, the importance of data transformation and why it is required for the reduction of biasness in data. So in order to reduce it, there are many forms of data transformation, and we can apply many mathematical tools like taking the log or natural log, or taking simply the reciprocal of the variable, or taking the square root or cube root of the variable. So these are many mathematical functions which can be used to transform the data, and once we have transformed that, then we basically transform all the variables along with that, because the transformation is not limited to one variable. So once one variable is transformed, then you have to transform all the variables as per the same formula. Though we did discuss about that there can be issues regarding data transformation. In some cases, it is highly argued by the researchers that data transformation can in fact do more harm to real data in this case. So it is very much advisable that the consequences of data transformation should be well thought out, and the implications should be seen in the light of the theory. Sometimes when you are performing data transformation, sometimes it is argued that instead of arithmetic mean, we are converting the whole data set into geometric mean. So technically speaking, yes, it is true that the nature of the data is changed, and that biases the data more as and as compared to that it reduces it. So it has issues. Different formulas have issues regarding data transformation, and there are controversies as well. But on the whole, these techniques do help us in basically normalizing the data, or stabilizing the variance to some extent. So yes, if you go to a very extreme in data transformation, then it can affect the nature of data as a whole, and it can harm data set more as compared to instead of stabilizing the data. So in this case, after that we discussed about reliability, why we use reliability, and why do we need reliability in this case. So in this case, reliability is basically to check the internal consistency of a set of questions or set of items, I would say, whether they are consistent and they reliably represent the construct they intend to represent. So let's say if we have got 6 questions which we are portraying to the respondent regarding training, then are these 6 questions really relative to training, and are they giving consistent results statistically? So can they be termed as reliable in any kind of setting, in any kind of industry? So that's what reliability is about, and basically the tool which we used in that case was Cronbach alpha, which is the name of the test which is applied in order to check the reliability. So just going through this Cronbach alpha function, well, we have basically discussed about this reliability thing. So just going through that briefly in order to have a recap, that we have just discussed it about the ability of reliability to measure basically the variables, their tendency to produce the same results under same conditions. So basically Cronbach alpha, as we have discussed before, it's a tool used to assess the scale reliability, and we basically used it as a index basically to define a specific construct, and it gives us some measure of internal consistency of the scale items, and whether these questions or items which you are portraying in the questionnaire, they are related to each other or not. This is what Cronbach alpha gives us a good idea about. So now here it also tells us whether the scale would be unidimensional or not. So going through that, we just went through the exercise of how to test reliability in SPSS, and how to basically use the tools available in SPSS to assess the Cronbach alpha, and what would be the score interpreting. So here we did discuss about that in case it's 0.90 or above, it's termed as high reliability. Then if it's between 0.80 and 0.89, it's good reliability, and then so on, like 0.70 to 0.79, it's termed as acceptable reliability, and then 0.65 to 0.69 is marginal reliability. Now normally we do accept the Cronbach alpha values which are above 0.7, but if you are deploying the questionnaire in an industry in which such an instrument has not been tested before, then in that case the value of 0.5 or higher would be acceptable. So the acceptable scale or rate would be downgraded to 0.5 in that case. So there are exceptions depending upon the nature of industry in which the questionnaire is being used and how it is being used. So that's why we say that lower thresholds are used in literature, but these are exceptional cases, and we have to differ this criteria basing upon industry to industry, because one important thing now has arisen specifically in business research, that no matter how much theories we try to generalize across the industries, it is now very important that every different industry must be separately tested for a theory, because most probably, so every industry has its own problems, it has got its own issues. So basically more advocation is now being done for industry specific research in this case. Industry specific research has got its own advantages, and now in fact now despite saying advantages, now it has become more necessary in business research and in business analysis that every industry phenomena should be seen as a totally different phenomena and should not be generalized to other industries. So basically, based on this point, most of the theories which we represent in business research literature or business analysis literature, it becomes very much irrelevant and more relevant to the specific industry study on where this whole study is being conducted. So now going through that, the important point is that normally when do we use this reliability phase? So it is very much advisable to, if we want to conduct a study in a specific industry, then it is always advisable to conduct a pilot study. And in pilot study, basically you just take 20 to 30 respondents, you get the questionnaire filled from them, and after that you try to analyze the reliability of the questionnaire from those 20 to 30 responses. And based on that, then we move ahead to the main analysis part. Now, similarly, in that pilot study, we also try to measure the validity of the questionnaire, because validity is an important phenomena, and it's an important tool to check. So basically, we have to see whether the instrument is really measuring what it intends to measure in this case. So in this case, there are many types of validity tests which can be conducted, but there are some very important validity tests which need to be tested, and two of them which are very important are, one is content validity and the other is construct validity. Now, content validity is basically used to test whether the content or the questions which are in the questionnaire are properly formulated. Do they really represent the instrument or the construct, and will they be able to capture the correct response? So in this case, content validity is tested by having a discussion with the industry experts and with the experts, relative experts in academia, and then when both of the experts basically give their opinion and give their corrections regarding the content of the questionnaire, then this questionnaire is basically said to be content valid. So when we are over with this process of getting the opinion of the subject experts and the industry experts regarding this content validity case and the content of the questionnaire, then the important thing comes that how to test the validity of such a questionnaire from statistical tests. And that's basically a very much preferable method, and that's why we basically conduct a pilot study, and in that pilot study we do try to get the responses of few respondents, and those respondents then are excluded from the main study, and that's why that specific pilot study response is specifically checked for construct validity in this case. Now here, what are the tools basically to test this construct validity? Now the one important tool in this case is termed as factor analysis. So factor analysis is one type of analysis basically which helps us in determining the construct validity, sorry. So in this case we have two types of factor analysis. One is exploratory factor analysis, and the other is called confirmatory factor analysis. So both have got their own uses. Both are used to check the construct validity, and though different softwares are used for both of them. Here, first of all, we will just go through the exploratory factor analysis for a start. So coming to the definition, that what is exploratory factor analysis. So it's just a technique which is used to define the structure among the variable in the analysis. So there is a specific structure which is in the variables used in the analysis, and basically what do we mean by structure? So let's say, for example, in this case we just have a look at the model which we used to draw, that we basically, if we're trying to find out the relationship between training and performance appraisal, and likewise career planning and employee participation. Now here then again, job definition. Now let's say we are just trying to find out the relationship between these five basically HR practices and their impact on individual employee performance. Now here is the employee performance. So this employee performance here is a dependent variable, and we just want to find out the impact or the relationship between these five practices and employee performance. Now here basically, first of all, we would like to see whether the questions which are used to measure the training, let's say these questions are 5 in number. We are using 5 questions to measure the training variable. All right. Then likewise we are using 7 variables, 7 questions for measuring performance appraisal. So likewise we are using different number of questions to assess each HR practice. Now let's say in this case we do know that every, let's say here in case of these 5 questions, here we are being told in theory that these 5 questions really represent the training construct. And now basically let's say I just want to test that these 5 questions really represent this construct or not. And in this case I just put all the questions related to these 5 variables at one place without distinguishing between them whether each variable is related to any construct or not. So here let's say if 5 questions are being used for measuring career planning, 3 are used for employee participation, and 3 for job definition. Now here in total, let's say these are these are basically 28 questions which are used to measure different HR practices. Now I just list down these questions, and for example, assume that after listing down I don't know which question belongs to which concept. I don't know whether the training question is related to training question or not. Is it related to the training variable or not? So I have just mixed up all these 28 questions related to job definition, employee participation, career planning, performance appraisal, and training. And I have no idea whether all these questions are grouped to specific variables which are listed here. So in order to find out the structure or the groups which exist within these questions, I would have to perform exploratory factor analysis. Now here is the difference between exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory. Now exploratory factor analysis is also termed as EFA, and confirmatory factor analysis is termed as CFA. Now the difference between these two is that in EFA you have got these 28 questions all out in open, and there is no restriction on SPSS to attach a question to only a specific variable. So I am not trying to test only these 5 questions related to training, and I cannot specify SPSS to ask to basically analyze this whole thing in such a way that these 5 questions related to training do associate themselves with the training constraint. So SPSS has got open choice to allot any question to any concept. It can attach a question related to training to performance appraisal, or it can attach it to career planning. So we basically are using EFA to explore certain group of items in which we are not sure which items may make a specific group and may represent a specific dimension. So that's why explored factor analysis is used to find out hidden infrastructure or hidden structures within a specific set of items which may not have been discovered before. Now here factor analysis basically is basically termed as defining groups or a structure which lies within group of items by basically seeing that which group of variables are more interrelated to each other, which have got high correlations with each other as compared to other groups. So it basically joins those more highly correlated variables to each other to form one group, and then likewise other groups are formed based on how highly interactive those variables are with each other. So in EFA we are exploring a group of items in which there is no restriction upon the software to only attach one specific group of questions to only a specific variable. So that's the freedom which is given in EFA, and that's why we use it for exploring purpose only. Then the other is confirmatory factor analysis. In confirmatory factor analysis, we basically bound these questions. For example, here, if you can see in CFA, these 5 questions which we have showed here would be bound to training construct, and likewise these 7 questions related to performance appraisal will be bound to performance appraisal construct, and CFA analysis will only tell us whether these questions which we have bound against each construct, whether they really represent that variable or not, whether they are valid or not. So there is no freedom given to the software to allocate a training variable question to a performance appraisal construct. So these cannot be cross-related. So the structure which we have defined before in theory or through our experience or through previous analysis, that structure when entered in the software for conduction of CFA test would remain same. The only thing which CFA will tell us is whether the structure which we have defined and which we have given to the software, whether it's valid or not. So there's a difference between EFA and CFA, and that's why EFA is used when we do have got a very broader dimension and we have got multiple questions measuring that dimension, and we want to know whether some specific dimensions exist in that specific broad concept. So we use EFA to identify those dimensions. And basically, on the other hand, CFA is used to verify an already proposed or tested model or a tested structure. So let's take an example here. Let's say we just see the questionnaire. Basically, this was the questionnaire which we discussed before. Now you can see the 6 questions which are related to the training variable. Likewise, you can see the 7 questions related to performance appraisal here. Now in this case, basically all of the questions which are relevant to the related constructs, these have been predefined, and as they have been predefined, then basically we can retest them through EFA, but more appropriate test in this case would be the confirmatory factor analysis. However, it must be seen and it must be basically observed that previous to year 2000, nearly in all type of business analytics and in business analysis, even to perform the construct validity on existing constructs which have been predefined, EFA was used previously, or in other words, exploratory factor analysis was used. But now after year 2000, specific tools have been developed in the form of confirmatory factor analysis, which are specifically used to test those kind of factor structures which have been predefined. Now here we are just taking an assumption on those basically variables which have been predefined, and we just jumble them up in questions form along with each other without defining to SPSS whether these questions all over are representing any specific dimensions or not in this case. So here basically in this case what we have been discussing about was this EFA application. So here in this lecture we would be focusing more on EFA part, which we have written here. CFA basically is used under a different software which is termed as MOS, and MOS software basically is an extension of SPSS software, and in which we have to graphically define each model, and then all these questions would be solidly linked to each construct which they represent, and the software cannot associate any variable related to a particular construct to any other construct in the model. So that's how CFA is deployed. Now coming to the EFA part, what is exactly the exploratory factor analysis? Basically it's the examination of the interrelationship among large number of variables, and basically it tries to explain the dimensions. So here basically what we are trying to say is that we have a huge lot of questions related to different human resource practices, and we want to know whether among these questions certain patterns or dimensions are there or not. So basically it starts to identify groups within a separate set of items or variables, and they then basically facilitate us in this case. Then these common underlying dimensions which have been identified through this process are termed as factors. Now here in this case, again, as it has been mentioned, that this is a data reduction technique. Now by data reduction here we mean that we are given a huge lot of items and questions, and in that case we are trying to create groups. Now when we are trying to create groups of questions, then in other words we are basically reducing the data. We are reducing those set of questions to, let's say, 5 or 6 groups, which would be more convenient for us for conduction of different types of analysis. So here basically the other important thing is that in this type of analysis there is no basically division between independent variable and a dependent variable. Why is that? We can go back to the diagram here which we have seen. Now here you can see the independent variables which are here. In case of dependent, if dependent variable is being measured through, let's say, 8 questions which basically would be asked from the manager of the firm about an employee performance. Now these 8 questions also represent a construct called employee performance. So basically all of these questions, including the dependent variable ones, would all be jumbled up in the software irrespective of whether these questions are related to independent variables or dependent variable. Now we just jumble them up, and then we try to find out the structure of each and every variable, whether they are independent or dependent, because in this case the structure of every construct would be evaluated separately and would be verified, and no distinction between dependent and independent variable would be made here logically, because all what we are trying to do here is just to identify the structure and dimensions, and the dimensions can be independent or dependent in this case. So this was the point which was being explained here. Then again, the term which is used here is summarization. Definitely when we are creating groups, we are summarizing the questions to one cohesive form. Now here all the variables would be considered simultaneously. No time division would be made here. So these are basically the various concepts of exploratory factor analysis, and we will then discuss in detail now how to basically conduct this type of factor analysis in this case. So here what you can see is that let's coming to a more cohesive diagram here. Let's say, just to have a clear distinction, if we draw the diagram of, let's say, 3 variables from above. One is training, the other is performance appraisal, and then third is, let's say, career planning. Now here we are basically grouping all the related questions to the relative construct. Now these questions have been locked to their respective construct here, and they cannot be reallocated to other construct in this case. So now this is a specific example of CFA, because we have bound all these questions with each construct, and they cannot be assessed, or we cannot be realigned, and one question from, let's say, performance appraisal cannot be assigned to training here. So basically, on the other hand, in exploratory factor analysis, we just make the chart of all these variables and we jumble them up in one platform, and then we ask the software to assign and groups to these variables to identify structure. Now in this case, the exploratory factor analysis makes new groups and based on the statistical responses, and what we have to do is to verify whether these statistically driven results do satisfy the theoretical foundation or not. So this was the difference between EFA and CFA technique. Now here, for example, let's have a look. What we are seeing here basically in this page is a correlation matrix among certain elements related to the store image, a certain basically cash and carry store, and in this case you can see that on this side here we are seeing certain variables which are related to various pricing aspects of certain products in a store. Now here we are assessing some commonly related factors coming under that store image, and we are trying to find out the correlation in between them. And from this correlation we do see some patterns which may be emerging from here. And in this case, now in the next diagram you can see that there's a pattern emerging here, and the pattern is being represented in the form of groups. For example, here you can see the pattern among these 4 variables is very much evident from the fact that 0.773 basically is the correlation between V3 and V8, then V9 and V3, and then all these groups of variables have got high correlation among each other, and they can be easily seen as forming a group among themselves. Then likewise we can see that there is another group emerging in the form of these 3 variables which are shown here, and you can see their pattern here in this case. So these high correlation again which are basically very much distinct among themselves in these 3 variables related to it, they do represent a separate group. And then we have got a patch of 2 last variables group which are basically very much vital, and they can basically give us some portrayal of these 2 values of a separate group here. So these groups here basically are representing certain number of items which can be associated with them, and though this is just a correlation, and they are basically through factor analysis we have just tried to group together, but how to basically use this technique called factor analysis, we can see it ahead. Basically here we are seeing an example of how factors can be derived from existing variables. Now here you can see certain group of variables which are shown here. For example, waiting time in a restaurant, in cleanliness, and friendly employees in a restaurant can be portrayed as service quality. But again, they can only be grouped together once they have been statistically proved to be portraying a certain group. So likewise then there is a group of other 3 variables which are being shown here, and these 3 basically again are portraying a separate group which are related to food quality. Now these are like taste and temperature and freshness. So basically in general we just were considering all these variables at first instant as separate variables which do not represent any group. But if you look ahead at them, even theoretically you can see that yes, let's say the first 3 do kind of represent a single concept which can be termed as service quality. But then in case of factor analysis we have to prove that through statistics and through real-time results obtained from respondents. So this was just an example of two basically factors which have been derived from exploratory factor analysis. We just put all the questions related to these variables in SPSS, and then we ran factor analysis on them, and these two groups were identified. On the other hand, in case of CFA, this whole phenomenon will become opposite, because in CFA we would be knowing these two factors, and we would be knowing that these three are related to food quality, and we would be knowing that these three variables are related to service quality, but we would be testing basically whether these three are really representing service quality or not. So that's the why we name this test as CFA. Once we have gone through that, then let's see how to carry on the factor analysis process. And there are basically 7 stages which are involved in formulating the factor analysis process. One is the objectives. What are the objectives? Then we have to design the factor analysis. Then is what would be our assumptions in factor analysis. Just like that we had certain assumptions, certain conditions for hypothesis testing, likewise we have got assumptions or conditions for factor analysis as well. Then we have the 4th stage, in which we have to derive those factors, and then we have to assess whether they are overall fit or not. Once we have derived the factors and we have determined their fit, then we have to interpret their meaning, because it's not just about creating random groups. You would have to see whether that specific group which is being identified statistically, whether that group is theoretically giving us a concept of unidimensional construct, or can these groups or can these variables be termed in one group, because SPSS does not know whether logically the variables or the questions which have been given to it in the software are logically viable or not, and under a certain group which SPSS is forming based on statistics. So SPSS basically is trying to judge the numbers entered in the software, not the concept. So once SPSS does make groups, then we have to see logically whether the groups formed based on statistics really sound logical or not, whether they do logically represent a common phenomena or not, or are they just a coincidence of figures which SPSS has just used to formulate the groups. So once we have gone through that, then we have to interpret them, that what is the meaning, and then again stage 6 is related to the validation of factor analysis, because it's not just about running the analysis and then just be happy with the results. We have to run further tests to validate whether this analysis which has been run has given real results. Then we would be discussing in stage 7 that what would be the additional usage of factor analysis. Now all these stages are very much important, and we cannot skip any stage during this factor analysis process, and we would have to give proper attention to each and every stage in order to ensure that this group forming is unbiased in this case. So coming to stage 1, the first thing is we have to define whether our objective is exploratory or confirmatory. And that is a very important concept, because as we have discussed before, that if the analysis is exploratory, then the nature of testing will get totally changed. And likewise, if you want to confirm an already existing structure, an already existing pattern, then again the nature of testing would totally change. So this is very important, that we decide first whether the data which is given to us is really exploratory in nature, or are we having an already existing pattern, and should we use confirmatory. Now here, now more advanced technique is basically advocating for using of both the methods. It is in fact calling for the first, okay fine, you should just apply EFA, try to explore whatever kind of groups exist, and then deploy CFA in order to revalidify whether the structure which has been advocated through exploratory factor analysis is really valid or not. Then coming to our specification of unit of analysis, that what would be the unit here, and are we basically focusing on the variables and their association, or are we basically using individuals? Because factor analysis is also related to the individual responses, in which it is identified whether we are going to test the association of several individuals to a certain concept, or in this case we are asking for just group of variables. So you can have basically two unit of analysis here. One unit of analysis which is used is termed as R unit of analysis. The other is called Q unit of analysis. Now our unit of analysis states that we have to use the variables as shown in the columns in SPSS, and we should evaluate their grouping with each other and their interrelationship with each other. On the other hand, in Q unit analysis, we are basically trying to look and gather and group the associations of individuals towards a certain concept in this case. So normally our unit of analysis is most commonly used. And then the third issue is related to data summarization or reduction. So whether we are basically trying to summarize the data, or are we trying to reduce the data in a certain form, and both have got separate implications. So then fourth is that we are just using this factor analysis with other techniques just to aid them up. So then the use of factor analysis would be different. So we have to be very much clear while stating these various objectives and answering these various objectives, because even if a simple objective is changed, then the nature of analysis which would be commenced after evaluating these objectives would get changed. And if we have assessed our objective wrongly, then the whole group formation which would be done at the end of this analysis would be biased and would be totally wrong. So this in this stage one, that's why the basic distinction between these various methods should be made and should be known to the user in order to avoid any hurdles in the future side. So in this case, these four objectives as stated are of extreme importance. Now, what are the analysis outcomes here? Like in data summarization, as we can see, that it does gives us some dimensions, and basically the whole data is reduced to smaller concepts, reduced to smaller explanatory variables, which makes our job more easier, because as if all of these, let's say 28 questions, are termed as separate variables and simultaneously entered into the equation in regression, then there is quite a chance that too many variables can cause the regression application to give incorrect results. Why is that? We would discuss that in our further discussions related to regression. So that's why it is very much important that if there are any dimensions which exist in that specific data set, they should be identified, and then basically these dimensions, some composite scores, should be used in order to avoid any further complication in a regression in this case. So then is the other outcome is related to data reduction. Basically this is further extension of the data summarization, in which the data which has already been summarized would be reduced to a single value, a single score. So let's say these 6 questions which have been associated with a single concept of training, now these 6 scores would be made more cohesive, more concise, by reducing them into a single score or a single factor or a single dimension in this case. So these are basically the 2 main outcomes which are considered and used in factor analysis. So today in this lecture we discussed about how to basically check the construct validity of a questionnaire, and basically the main tool which is used to assess the construct validity of a questionnaire was discussed. Factor analysis is one main type of tool which is used to assess the construct validity, and then we discussed that why factor analysis is useful, why it is being used, and basically what's the meaning of factor analysis and how it is used to identify a hidden structure within a data set. Once that structure is basically aligned, then again how to interpret that structure. Then we discussed about the various types of factor analysis which are used, and we discussed about exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis, and why is exploratory factor analysis used and what's the importance of that. And in case we have to identify a pattern from group of questionnaires, a group of questions which have not been identified before in the form of a group, so in that case we use exploratory factor analysis as we are trying to explore new groups within a certain set of variables. And then we discussed about when would we be using confirmatory factor analysis and how a certain group of variables, when grouped together, should be aligned to form a group and can only be tested and cannot be cross-linked to each other in terms of confirmatory factor analysis. So then we discussed about the various stages which are involved in a factor analysis phenomena and why these stages are important, and how we cannot avoid any stage in any case because it would be ending up in biasness of factor analysis results. Then we discussed about the first stage and that what would be our objectives in factor analysis, and it's very important to go through that what kind of unit of analysis we are trying to use, what type of factor analysis we would be using. And then again, after we have defined our unit of analysis, this is vital that we basically be very clear whether we are going for data summation and or data reduction. So this is another important part. So this was related to this lecture. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.